So the purpose of this video is to teach you about how we graph data in physics, and to start that graphing process, we need to make sure that we have a data table. So in class today, we talked about a data table, which I'll draw an example one right here. And there are lots of ways to draw data tables, as long as the data table is organized, you'll be okay. As long as it's organized and it shows your data, not just in a list all over the place, but in a nice table. However you organize that table is fine with me. I'm just going to give you an example of one way that I find to be an easy way to organize it. So in this square right here, I'm going to write my independent variable, and I'll choose thickness, just like some of you did in class. And then I'm underneath, in parentheses, I'm going to write the unit, number of noodles. Then up here, I'm going to write my dependent variable, which in this case for all of you was strength. I'm going to put the unit, number of marbles. Now that I've written the variable and the unit, I don't need to put those units on all of my numbers in my data table. Remember that this is trial 1, trial 2, trial 3, and this is the average strength. So, other components of a data table, it needs to have the name of the independent variable and dependent variable with units. Okay, so those two things. It needs to be organized, and it also needs to tell the name of the variables with their units. So let's say that I do this experiment and I fill in my data. I did 5 thicknesses. And in trial 1, I'm just going to make up some data. It held 1, 2, 3, average of 2, 2, 3, 4, 3, 4, 5, 4, 5, 6, 5, 6, 7. So this is pretend data. And I've got that on average, a 1 noodle bridge held 2 marbles. What I do next with that data is I graph it. So I'm going to come down here, and we're going to talk about the characteristics or the qualities of a good graph. Sorry for the clicking of my pen. I know that might be a little weird. So a good graph, first, has labeled axes. A graph has 2 axes. In math class, you might call this the y-axis, but we call it the dependent axis. And down here, we have what you might call the x-axis. In math class, we call it the independent axis. The reason we don't call them x and y is because sometimes x will be on the dependent axis because x stands for position. So in physics, we tend not to call them the x and y axes because x has a special meaning in physics, and so does y sometimes. All right, so the independent axis is down here. So when we label our axes, we need to put our dependent variable on the dependent axis. So in this case, my dependent variable was strength. So I label it and give it its unit, number of marbles. And my independent axis, oops, a little too far there, was thickness. Yours might have been span. And the unit is number of noodles. So labeled axes with units is one characteristic. The second characteristic is a title. The title of a graph is always dependent variable versus independent variable. So for this graph, my title would be strength versus thickness. Okay, and you might want to put something in there about what experiment it was. So I might say 4 spaghetti bridges. And you'll have more space because you have a larger graph. But strength versus thickness for spaghetti bridges is my title. The third characteristic, and this is where we might differ from math a little bit, is our axes labels, axes divisions. Something to note is that in physics, we always start our graph at 0, 0. So on this graph, when I go to label, I'll do this in red, these divisions down here and up the side, my first division is 0, 0. Then the only requirement is that each square is worth the same amount. So let's look up here. I've got thicknesses of 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And if I come back down here, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 squares to label. So I think I'm going to choose every other square. So the first square is going to be 1, or the second, I'm going to go skip a square, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay? On the way up, I have the same number, so I might do that again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. You want to make sure that you use the whole graph paper. So make the spaces big enough that you can use the whole graph paper. And what I mean by that is tomorrow when you bring your graph in, I don't want to see any that have just this little part of the graph used. There's like a graph in here and this part doesn't get used. Don't do this. Use the whole paper. So spread your squares out. And they don't have to go every other square. You could go every 3 squares, or you could go, every other square. These two axes don't even have to be the same number of squares per number. All right, so once you've got that, you're going to start with part number 4, which is plotting your points. So my first point, when I look up here, is 1, 2. This is my independent variable, dependent variable. So my first point is 1, 2. So I go over to 1 and up to 2, and I make a little tiny dot. And then I do what's called a point protector. I circle that dot. Then I'm going to do that for 2, 3, over to 2, up to 3, 3 up to 4, 4 up to 5. And remember, I made this data up, so I know what shape it's going to be. And I'm going to put my point protectors, and then 5, 6. The last step is to draw what we call a line of best fit. Now this isn't to connect the dots, so do not connect the dots. Okay? And I'll check your graphs tomorrow in class. But do not connect the dots. Take a ruler and try to fit the line, the dots as best you can, and then trace along the straight line. And that's the final step for today. So what you need to do tonight is first organize your data if you didn't in class. You can do that on a sheet of paper or the back of the graph paper. This will get turned in, so you need to make sure you do this. And then the second thing is to graph your data. So you can rewind this video and watch the steps again. You can check my graph, but use the information from this video to organize your data and graph your data. And that will be, the third thing you need to do is staple your graph and data table to the lab packet. See you tomorrow. And don't forget, we have first lunch. So you have class at 12:20. Have a good night.